Hey guys, welcome to the channel. My name is Coach Hall and I'm an AP Lang teacher. In this video, we're going to be talking about, first of all, the test and how everything is calculated to get to a 3, a 4, or a 5 composite. And then we're going to look at each of the sections of the exam, starting with the multiple choice and then going through all 3 essay questions. That way you know insider tips from an AP teacher about what you should be doing in order to prepare for the exam in order to get your best score possible. Before we get to the tips for each section of the test, it's important to know how the test works. So approximately 45% of your test score comes from the multiple choice section. And so there's going to be anywhere from 52 to 55 questions on the multiple choice portion. In order to figure out your sub-score for this, if you're taking a practice exam, take the number that you answered correctly and multiply it by 1.25. Later on in the video, we're going to be talking about tips for each of the specific essays. However, in order to understand how everything is scored in relation to your composite, you need to understand that each essay is scored on a scale of 1 to 9. We want to shoot for at least a 5 or higher because 5 is kind of considered adequate. Like we want to shoot for at least a 5. Now you're going to take that number. So let's say you make a 5. You're going to multiply it by 3.0556. So the essays have a higher multiplier. The essays are actually combined to make up 55% of your score. So if you are a strong writer, you want to play to those strengths on the exam. Once you have determined how many points you earned with the multiple choice and multiplied it by the multiplier, and then taken each of your 3 essay scores and multiplied it by the essay multiplier, then you're going to add those 2 scores together. And so generally speaking, it depends on like what the curve is that year and how many multiple choice questions there were and so forth, but you want to be shooting for about 80 points in order to get a 3. It could be as high as 82. I've seen it as low as 78 on some different resources that I have, but basically 80 is kind of like that middle ground. So you want 80 points to be on track for a 3. Now, if you want a 4, you're going to be looking at approximately 98 points. Again, I've seen it kind of range, and so it could be 96. It just depends. And so they don't actually tell you how many points you earned. They just give you your composite when you actually get your scores. And I think that's kind of a point of frustration for some students, is they want to know where they fell in that range. But basically, if you're doing a mock exam or a practice test and you're trying for a 4, you want to get approximately 98 points. And then for a 5, you want to be shooting for approximately 112 points. So obviously, if you're close to the bottom of the cutoff, like 80 points or 98 points, then you want to look at where you can improve. Usually, honestly, if you go up 1 point on an essay, that gives you a bigger cushion. But for some students, their essays are as good as they're going to get, so to speak, and they really need to focus on the multiple choice. So think about where you can earn a few extra points just so that you're not on that border of like the lower end of a certain composite score. Pacing for the exam is something that I highly recommend students practice. In fact, my own students practice this throughout the entire year. So let's talk about multiple choice pacing first. Each passage is going to have a different number of questions, and so the more questions there are for a passage does not actually mean that you should spend more time on that passage. You should spend 15 minutes per passage maximum if you're working to pace to finish. So what this means is that sometimes the passages with more questions actually have easier questions. And so it should not take you any longer than a passage that has fewer questions and is shorter but is more dense. So I would recommend that you get a watch and you practice. If you're far out from the exam, maybe at least a month or 2, or even, I would say maybe even 2 weeks, you can start at maybe 18 minutes a passage and try to work your way down to improve your speed. But the goal is 15 minutes a passage because there are 4 passages and you have 60 minutes. Now for the essays, you're going to get a 15-minute reading period where you can annotate, and a lot of students spend their time looking at the different sources for the synthesis question. And a lot of students write the synthesis first. Now, as a point of clarification, you do not need to write the essays in order. So if you are strong at, let's say, rhetorical analysis and you want to get that out of the way, then go ahead, get it out of the way. They will look through your test booklet, and before they can give you a 0, 2 people have to look and make sure your essay is definitely not in there. So you don't have to do 1, 2, 3. Another point of clarification for the essays is that the recommendation is 40 minutes. Now, some students want to spend maybe 45 minutes on one essay and 35 on another, and so that's something you want to practice, is writing for 40 minutes. It's okay to spend 45 on one if you know you're going to be able to do the other in 35, but the way you know that you can do that is by practicing. So I would recommend looking at the release questions on the College Board website, looking at the student samples too, figure out what they're looking for. I would read the ones that are a 5 or higher, and I would try to emulate those because that's going to be what gets you to pass the exam. So it does take practice, and I would even recommend practicing writing 2 or even 3 essays back to back, because you're going to be writing them all 3 one right after the other during the exam, and writing for 40 minutes can be really strenuous, but writing 3 essays, 40 minutes each, is gonna, honestly, it's gonna make your hand cramp. It's okay. So you need to practice that. Now, I'm not saying that if you practice it a ton, your hand is magically gonna be muscular and you're not gonna feel anything on test day. Like, that's not what I'm saying. But you need to practice that, like, mental and physical stamina of writing 3 essays back to back. So those are my tips as far as pacing. I think pacing is really important. I think pacing is a learned skill. So I would practice before the exam, either in class or on your own, in order to achieve the appropriate pace. Because if you miss pace and you are too slow, then it could really hurt your score. Okay, let's get into specific tips for each of the sections. So for multiple choice, the first thing you need to remember is that you need to answer all of the questions. There is no penalty for guessing, and there is no penalty for wrong answers. So you only gain points for right answers. And because of that, I think it's really important to realize that you need to answer all the questions. So let's talk about a couple different scenarios. What do you do if you don't pace to finish, and therefore you have 10 or more questions at the end of the test that you just will not have time to read and answer? Choose one letter and just bubble it in. Now, if you are done and you have looked at all 55 questions and answered it, but you have maybe 10 that are kind of sporadic that you skipped, and you maybe have a few minutes and you're like, I don't know what to do. One thing to consider, and this is going to take practice and like a little bit of understanding, is to remember that each of the 5 answer choices, because the AP test goes from A to E, is going to be offered approximately 20% of the time. Is it exactly 20% of the time? No. But if you can keep a tally very quickly as you're answering questions, if you have like just like somewhere you can write on your exam, if you can keep track of how many times you've used A as an answer, or B or C or D or E, and you notice that, let's say you've done B 13 times, but you've only done A 7 times, then I would go back into those missing questions, the ones that you skipped, and I would bubble in A. So I've looked at a few different secure tests. These are things that teachers have access to. And in the big picture, there have been a few times where it's like one answer choice just sort of stops, and it's only used once, maybe twice in a series of 17 questions. And so if you notice that you haven't used a certain answer the same amount of times as the others, then if you have 0 clue, like if you have no time to read it and you just have to bubble something in before time is called, then look for the answers that have sort of been like underused as opposed to the ones you're frequently using. Also, it's totally myth that C is the right answer. So only do that if you can tell that you haven't been using C a lot. Another thing to think about is that the questions are done in isolation. And what I mean by that is that you can have the same answer, like you can have B 4 times in a row. And a lot of students are like, wait a minute, like I've already used it 3 times. It can't be B the 4th time. Or they're like, maybe I need to go back and look at these, because if I have B this time and it's the 4th B, then maybe one of the first 3 are wrong. That's not true. So it can be the same letter, like B, 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 A, like it's okay. So don't look for patterns. Don't overthink patterns. They're not patterns. Each question is viewed individually. So it's okay if you have the same letter choice back to back. Don't like spend time trying to talk yourself out of an answer that you've already convinced yourself of, because that's just wasting your time on the test. One thing to keep in mind with the question 1 synthesis essay is that you don't want to be trapped by easy sources. So students often look at photos, cartoons, tables, charts, graphs, those kinds of things, and they're like, oh, this is easy because I don't have to read anything. Well, sometimes these are actually really difficult to interpret, or they're difficult to make work for your actual argument. So don't spend time trying to interpret a graph that you really don't understand or just simply can't use. Take the time to read the passages instead. So don't go for a source just because it looks easy. That's probably going to be to your detriment in the end. So really think about which sources will support your argument and maybe one that you can argue with. I recommend 2 that support your claim and 1 that you can contradict or refute. So don't go for something that looks easy because you're not actually going to save yourself time. So it's okay to read passages. Like, don't look at a passage and go, oh, it's too long, I don't have time, and then spend 5 minutes trying to figure out how you're supposed to interpret a cartoon. One of the things that scorers are looking for in the synthesis is your voice. They don't want a summary of the sources. They want your opinion and your voice to come through. So in order to make an argument that is not driven by the sources, but rather supplemented by the sources, you want to figure out your opinion before you actually read the documents that are attached. And so there's going to be times perhaps when you know nothing about the topic at hand, in which case they do give you a little bit of history or context within the actual prompt itself. But those are the times where, like, for instance, with eminent domain, I had a lot of students who wrote really good essays about eminent domain, but they didn't know what it was before they actually had to write it on their mock exam this year. And so that was a time where it was more appropriate to go to the sources, because that was how they were going to be most successful. And they made their opinion after reading the sources. But for the most part, like things like public libraries or the penny or monuments or honor codes or other topics that have been used in the past that are a bit more approachable, you can have an opinion on those before reading the documents. And in that case, I recommend that you choose 2 sources that support the stance you intend to take, and then 1 that is against it that you can basically refute. So that ratio will get you 3 sources, which is my next tip. It's super, super important to use 3 sources. In fact, it's basically mandatory, because if you cannot use 3 sources and cite them clearly in your essay, then you're not in contention for a 5 out of 9 or higher. So you can either use the author's last name, which will be provided for you, or you can refer to it as source A, source B, whatever. Scorers are not supposed to have a preference. Personally, as a teacher, I prefer to read it as source A because I remember them by their letter. But if we're talking about like a research paper in class, I want the author's last name. So it's not supposed to matter, but you must cite it. And so some students like to integrate it into their topic sentence, like, as you can see in source A. That's not necessarily the strongest way to do it, because then you're driving your paper by sources. So instead, make the claim, like paraphrase what we're supposed to find out or interpret it for us. Make your claim however you're going to do it and put the source in parentheses at the end of your sentence. That makes it less distracting, but you're still citing it correctly. For question 2, rhetorical analysis, it's very important to understand the author's purpose. So it depends on which prompt you're given, but I recommend that students take a second to just kind of brainstorm what I call power verbs. So here's an example. Let's say we're talking about the prompt that was Margaret Thatcher's eulogy for Ronald Reagan. Well, we know a eulogy is a funeral speech, and so funeral speeches are meant to honor the dead. So if I was trying to prepare for this exam as I was taking it, I would say, okay, pays tribute, honors him, pays her respects, remembers him fondly. I would just list as many things as I could think of that would appeal to purpose, memorialize, any of those kinds of words or phrases. This will help for a couple of reasons. One, it's helping you figure out the purpose, which sometimes the occasion dictates what the purpose is. So another example of this would be a commencement speech, which is a graduation speech. So you need to think about why they are writing the speech or writing the letter or writing the essay, whatever it is. Figure out why. That's the purpose. And so I would brainstorm some power verbs before I started writing my essay, because a lot of students don't vary their word choice. They latch on to one word, usually one of the words in the prompt, and they go with that and they write it like 7 times in 4 paragraphs, and it gets really redundant. So if you take a second to give yourself a list and you really think about purpose, like why is the author doing this? Then it will help you avoid a strategy-driven essay. So it's okay to mention strategies and choices. However, most of your paragraph and your analysis needs to be why they're using that strategy. And so another thing to think about is actually what the relationship is between the speaker and the audience. So let's take the commencement speech, for example. This was on the 2018 exam. So a commencement speech is a graduation speech. When a person's graduating, they're expecting to hear a speech about like life advice and, you know, the kind of cliche, like one chapter's closing and now we're starting a new chapter kind of stuff. So in this particular passage that students were given, it was a female speaker, Madeleine Albright, speaking to a female audience, because it was a women's college, on their graduation day. And in that speech, she was actually referencing other women, and her message, she said it multiple times, was to persevere. So I actually did a previous video on this. If you're curious, I will link it below if you want to know how to interpret that speech a little bit more clearly. But the thing is you have to think about the audience, because twice recently, the College Board has given a female speaker, female audience scenario. The other one was Claire Booth Luce speaking to a group of female journalists. So keep that in mind, because audience matters. And so audience will also sometimes dictate the purpose. So for Margaret Thatcher's, she was actually giving a eulogy. So obviously the people present heard her, but eulogies for presidents are typically televised. So in a way, she was also speaking to the American public. Now, she worked closely with Ronald Reagan, but she was from Great Britain. So there were certain strategies that she had to use to establish her relationship with Ronald Reagan, and therefore appeal to credibility as to why she was fit to give this speech and how she wanted the American people to remember him, because obviously she knew him differently than they did. Another thing to consider is letters. Letters have an audience of 1. Okay, so unless it was somehow written to a group of people, letters have an audience of 1. So let's think about one that was used rather recently, which is the Abigail Adams prompt. Now that year it had a really low scoring average, because apparently a lot of students were like, wait a minute, like we've been practicing speeches, like this is a letter, we don't know how to do this. Yes, you do, it's the same thing. You're going to analyze purpose. And in the prompt it said how she advises her son. So let's think of other words besides advises. We've got mentors, guides, counsels. So already we've got different word choice that we can use. All right. And then a lot of students probably know about Abigail Adams from like history classes and stuff. So you don't want to bring in a ton, if any, outside knowledge, but it probably should have been apparent to you that she was writing to her son when he was a child. He was not the president of the US yet, nor was her husband a president yet. It referenced it in the prompt saying, I believe, that he was a diplomat. So you want to think about, okay, if he's traveling abroad and she's giving him a metaphor of this river and how the river gets stronger away from its source, well, it fits his current situation because his source is home, or perhaps even her, and he's going far away. And so he's getting stronger. So how is he getting stronger? Well, he's gaining knowledge and he's gaining personal experience. So that's her purpose. Yes, she's trying to advise him, but advise him of what? All right. So that's the things you got to think about for question 2. If you can nail purpose and connect it to the speaker audience, like the rhetorical triangle, then you've got a solid essay. So yes, you want to think about strategies and devices to an extent, but those are a vehicle to get to the important part, which is analysis. And what do we analyze? We analyze purpose, and then we also analyze the speaker's relationship with his or her audience and how that impacts the choices that he or she has made to convey his or her message. For question 3, the argumentative essay, it's important that you assert a position. You need to make a claim that is arguable, and it's important then to have a counterclaim and rebuttal. So you don't want to try to take on both sides of the issue, but instead make a clear stance and make an argument. It needs to be something that people can debate, something that people could agree or disagree with. So you need to have a clear position, a claim, a stance. We call it all different kinds of things, but basically it needs to be clear what you're arguing for or against and why. One of the things that you need to remember with question 3 is that you need evidence, and you need to remember that you need a voice. You want your argument to be convincing, and oftentimes the most convincing arguments are ones where the evidence is basically in the speaker's wheelhouse. So what do I mean by that? Maybe you're super good at history, or at least you've had a really strong year in APUSH and you can pull in historical examples with a lot of authority. You don't want to give a ton of historical context, but maybe that's your evidence. Or maybe you're a musician and you can bring in an example from music, or you're an athlete and you can bring in a sports example, or you're really interested in science. A lot of these topics are broad enough that you can use examples from pretty much anything to prove your point. And so stay true to what you know. Think about evidence that you can use to write well. If you're reaching for something that you can barely talk about or barely have a conversation about, then it probably doesn't belong in the paragraph of an argumentative essay. Because when students write about something that they know well, their argument is stronger. You can just tell that they understand what they're writing about. And so obviously connect it to the prompt, connect it to the issue at hand, but choose evidence that you know well, because it's not always about having the most sophisticated evidence. If you have this really awesome example, but you can't talk about it effectively, then you have nothing. Whereas you might have this kind of cheesy, kind of like mediocre example, kind of like, oh, well, that's not really sophisticated. But if you can write about it in a way that shows voice, and you can assert a position and use that example to back up that position, then you've done what the task has asked. And that's really important. So choose examples that you're actually able to write about and stop worrying about, like, is this good enough? Make sure that you're proving a point. That's what they're looking for. So this is just observation here and slight opinion. It's not an official College Board stance. However, at a lot of the trainings that I've been to, the speakers and the readers that I've spoken to have said that they prefer that students use historical evidence or current events when appropriate. So this is building off of the previous point. Write about what you know well. If you don't know history well and you can't think of a good example, then choose something else. However, there is sort of a hierarchy of evidence. So historical examples and current events, because they're based in fact, tend to be more convincing and more logical. So if you can brush up on current events and you can brush up on certain aspects of history, then this could help you. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't write about literature or you shouldn't write about personal experience, but if you can use something that is grounded in reality as at least one of your examples, it tends to make a stronger essay. But again, it has to be well argued. If it's really superficial, then it doesn't matter. You need something that you can write about well, but it's also important to try to at least base one of your pieces of evidence in something that has actually happened. Before I get into this next piece of advice, I want to be very clear here that this is just my opinion. This is not what the College Board has said. But I think students should avoid writing about religion and politics, specifically because even though it might be something that you know a lot about, and I did say that you should write about what you know if you can have appropriate evidence, a lot of times these types of examples can be very inflammatory. And when students are very passionate about a religious example or a certain political example, whether it's a biblical example or whether they're passionate about Trump or Clinton or whatever, oftentimes students present things in a way that is very absolute, and we want to try to avoid absolutisms in writing. And another thing is that students tend to forget to include a counterclaim and rebuttal when they write about religion and politics. So I'm speaking generally here, like obviously there are probably some exceptions in which students have done this successfully, but just keeping in mind, like the average student tends to perhaps stray from the prompt a little bit when religion or politics get brought up. And so at first, the example might be really good evidence, but then students sometimes tend to get on their soapbox and get a little bit preachy, or they operate under an assumed knowledge that basically assumes that the person reading the essay agrees with your line of thought. And so that might not be the case. And so the scorer is not supposed to bring in any bias, but oftentimes when you bring in religion and politics, you open up some territory that can be avoided just by using a different example. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't have political beliefs. I am not saying you shouldn't have religious beliefs. I'm just saying that these might not be the best things to include in argumentative writing just because they can be very polarizing. And so my advice would be to stay away from those two topics. Several scorers that I have spoken to, so these are people who go to the national reading every year and they actually score the AP tests, have said that they recommend that students be very careful when referencing literature in their argumentative essays. Now, here's why. With history and current events, it's based in fact. Now, it seems kind of odd since AP Lang is a form of AP English. Why would you not accept literary examples? Here's the reason. It's not that they're unacceptable, it's that oftentimes they're not executed well because students tend to give a plot summary instead of actually explaining how the certain scene or portion of the book that they're analyzing relates to and proves the argument that they're trying to make. Oftentimes when you're referencing a novel, you have to contextualize it for your reader, and you waste so much time and page space giving context that you don't actually get to your point. Now, I have seen students use literature successfully. For example, for the Oscar Wilde disobedience prompt, one of my own students wrote about Anthem and did so very effectively. But the reason that that student did it very well was because there wasn't a whole lot of plot summary. The student connected the disobedience to the trajectory of the novel and explained why disobedience mattered. And prior to this, in a previous paragraph, the student had used a historical example and there was a connection between the two. So it flowed very well. On some release samples that I have seen from the disobedience prompt, there was a score of a 4 and a score of a 6. Both of them referenced the Hunger Games. The difference is that the 6, the student who wrote that, he or she actually connected it to the larger meaning and really focused on the disobedience and didn't overly give too much context. And I think the example of disobedience in the 6 was more sophisticated than the approach the student who wrote the 4 had. And so it's okay to use literature, but you want to be very careful not to offer a summary because you're trying to prove a point. So sometimes with literary examples, students just lose sight of what the task actually is, and you're not analyzing plot or theme here. You are trying to prove your argument. So just be a little bit careful with literary examples. I'm not saying you can't do them. In fact, if you have no other ideas and you're taking the test, then go for it. But just try not to turn it into a book summary. Thank you guys so much for watching. These are what I would consider to be my most useful tips as an AP teacher to give AP students in preparation for the exam. So if you did find this helpful, please don't forget to like this video. Comment below what tips you think are useful to students if you've taken the AP Lang exam in the past or if you're taking it this year and you have tips that have worked for you. Please share those below because it might help other students. And if you are a high school junior and you're going to be applying for colleges in the fall, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel because throughout the summer and into next fall, I will be posting several college application tips videos, and you don't want to miss that kind of content either. If you are taking the AP Lang test soon, best of luck. Trust yourself. Just go for it. You've got this. All right, guys, until next time, happy writing.